the title of this video, 5 Weird Games That Taught Me Game Design, it's a little disingenuous. It's not clickbait, but they're not that they're weird games, but it's weird that these games would have been instrumental to my learning. I have to tell you, when I first started in design, I was coming at it really as a writer, wannabe director of movies. And so I was much more idea-based, character-based, story-based. So I had never, even though I had made little Apple games when I was a kid on my Apple IIe, I had never thought about game design like as a craft. So there was a lot of struggle at the beginning, especially because it wasn't like it is today where you have multiple game designers at the company that you can go to and that they can train you and help you and mentor you. Back then, they didn't even have a role called game designer at Sony. I think even though I was doing game design, my paycheck in the hierarchy called me an associate producer. So it was a lot of learning on the job, and there was no one to go to, and you just had to kind of figure it out. Because back then, most of the design before there were designers was just like the artists and the coders making shit up as they went. So I kind of went through this whole process of learning. I mean, I was playing games all the time as a kid and as a teenager and stuff, but I never played them with an eye towards learning how they worked and why they worked and taking them apart and stuff. And so, of course, you play the big stuff. You play the big hits. Around this time, obviously, there was the Mortal Kombats, and there was the Super Star Wars, and there was the Link to the Past and all that. But the funny part about it was where you actually can learn from. And if you want to design or you're curious about design, it's just a craft. Honestly, playing a lot of games is not only important, but playing a lot of games that you wouldn't usually play are pretty important, because there are lessons that you can learn from those titles. So I wanted to make a video that was 5 games, and I'll give you a bonus one at the end because you never stop learning. There's 5 games that, as I was sort of coming up as a designer, taught me a lot about design. And I think you'll be surprised by a number of them. Here we go. These are the 5 games that, at least in part, there are obviously many, many more, but 5 crucial games that taught me the craft of game design. The first time I remember a light bulb going off and recognizing, oh, this is a craft. This is a skill, game design. It's not just about the ideas. It's about what's happening in the player's head and how you can manipulate what's happening in the player's head to keep them engaged and interested. I know this sounds crazy, but this game, Uno, the card game, I had played growing up on and off, but it wasn't until I started playing a lot of it during the making of Twisted Metal and Twisted Metal 2 that my brain was just sort of on the lookout for knowledge and experience in this field of design. Like, how do we make the game more fun? Why isn't it more fun now? One night it just occurred to me to think strategically. I know it's so obvious, but if you just are a customer of games, which is all I was at that point, you just kind of play. You don't really analyze it and think about why it's working on you. And I had a moment, an epiphany, when I was playing against my wife, and I think we had a couple friends over, where I had like a draw 4 and a wild card and whatever. And in the past, I would just play them when I got them. Oh, I got a wild card. Fuck you. Change to green. Oh, I got a draw 4. Fuck you. Right? And for some reason, I just started thinking, well, what if I held these off until strategic moments? Now, Uno is not a very strategic game. It's 90% luck, probably more. But there is a little bit of strategy. And if you hold cards until you think you might need them, your percentage chance of winning goes up. And so when I had that moment of like, oh my God, this feels great. It feels so good when I save up some of these cards instead of just playing them willy-nilly and totally decimate my enemy, because I had that strategic plan, and I waited for my moment, and I took it, and it paid off, and you feel like a fucking rock star. And I was like, oh my God, I want our game, which at the time was Twisted Metal 1 and or 2, it was around the same time we were kicking around, I think the sequel, to feel that way. And again, I know this sounds so basic, but if you don't study game design, why would you think about this stuff, right? Why would you think about how strategic gameplay works? So when we designed the power missile, the homing missile, and the fire missile in Twisted Metal, those were very much based on wanting the player to recognize the right time and place to use those specific attacks. Whereas I think maybe in the first Twisted Metal, it was like, fuck it, I got a missile, I'll fire it off. But we tuned them more in Twisted Metal 2, so it really made sense. That power missile had no homing on it, but it was devastating if you could get a hit. The homing missile was incredibly weak, but it was easy to finish off people. So it was like, okay, I'm going up against this guy in Twisted Metal 2. I know that whenever I whittle him down, he runs and he's faster than me. So I'm going to save up my homing missiles, which don't do a lot of damage. But when he runs, he's probably only got 20% health left. And suddenly, boom, I'm firing 2 or 3 homers that I've saved up through the course of the battle, which I hadn't used. And I take him out because he can't dodge him, right? I was like, oh my fucking God. That was amazing. Amazing. As a bonus, if we're speaking about Twisted Metal, a lot of people don't know this. There's a bridge right here in Twisted Metal 2 in the Hollywood level. And if you plant a gas can under it and detonate the gas can, the remote bomb, while someone's driving on it or under it, it's an instant kill. I just thought this was the cleverest thing in the world. I was like, people are going to do this. They're going to feel like badasses. But again, this is one of those lessons that I didn't learn from another game. I learned from our game, which was after all the effort to put that in, and at the time it was a lot of effort, and I realized no one's doing it. And I'm like, why? And it occurred to me, it's like, oh, well, because the quickest path and the easiest and most focused path to success is the path you're going to take. So in the time it would take someone to get the remote bomb, drive over there, put it under the bridge, wait for someone to come along and then detonate it, yeah, you might feel like a badass for sure. But most people were just like, I could do that, but my goal is to kill the guy. It's easier to fire missiles at him and lob the ricochet bombs at him and launch napalm at him. Why the fuck would I go through all that trouble? And that was a good lesson too, which is like a good idea is great if the good idea and the gameplay are totally marbled into each other in terms of their reason to be. But to build a whole bunch of play mechanics just for a moment that you may or may not have and probably won't, it's a waste of resources. And it was a real eye-opener for me. Again, coming from movies, I was an idea guy. I was a writer. I was like, that's a cool moment. It's like, yeah, but a game is not made up of individual moments. Most of the best parts of the game happen in your head based on the planning and thinking and trying things that you've thought up. So all this kind of sprang out of Uno, though, of course, which was crazy to me. But Uno was very important. When I was Twisted Metal 1, Mike Guillaume, fellow designer on that title and Warhawk and Jetmoto and whatnot, we would go down to the Westwood Arcade a lot. You know, we would try all kinds of things. This is, you know, 3D was brand new, right? So we were playing, I remember going down there with Mike and we would play Virtual Racer from Sega. And I would drive and I would tell Mike, I'd say, okay, if you don't know the cabinet had these 3 buttons on it. And it was POV camera, third person removed, far, third person close, something like that. And you could physically hit these buttons on the cabinet and it would change the camera. And I said to Mike, I said, don't tell me when you're going to change the camera. I just want to drive and I want to see if camera cuts and camera motion works in the context of playing. Does it feel like you're in a movie or is it distracting? So we would go down there because we didn't have 3D at the time. PlayStation had been announced, but there was mostly a couple of PC games. There wasn't a lot of ways to experiment with it before we got the game up and running. And this was months before the first builds of Twisted Metal came in. So we went down there to play Cyber Sled because the guys out in Utah, and they had never made a game before, they were like, hey, how do you want this AI to work? What's the philosophy? Fuck, I don't fucking know. I never even thought about artificial intelligence and how it would work in a video game. So we go down to play Cyber Sled, which was a launch title for PS1, but it was an arcade game first. And we were like, okay, well, let's just pump a bunch of quarters in there and let's see how the AI works. You know, we probably spent the first 45 minutes driving the tank around and going, okay, maybe this one's a little more aggressive. Does he fire more frequently? Do any of them ever run? And then while we stopped playing, we had the game running, but Mike and I were taking notes or talking. We looked over at the radar and the enemy tank wasn't moving. And we realized that the AI in the game does not move if you don't move, right? I mean, if it's aimed at you, it might fire, but if you just don't touch the controls at the beginning of the game, the AI just sits there. If you go behind a pillar and just let go of the controls, do nothing, the AI will sit wherever it is, right? The AI, for whatever reason, is based on your motion, not based on sort of its own wind-up toy philosophy. Well, this was amazing to me. It was this moment of going, video game AI is not about mirroring real-life behavior. It's about creating behavior that makes the player feel a certain way. Even if you have to cheat and lie and use smoke and mirrors like Cyber Sled was, that's more important. You'd rather have that than the world's most sophisticated AI of how somebody would actually drive in Twisted Metal. You want chases more frequently. You want cars to run more frequently so you can be on the offense and they're on the defense. Things like that. Never knew, never thought about. I was just like, well, let's figure out within reason how we can mimic a player. It's like, well, you don't want to do that when you're doing AI. The AI's job is to be like a host at a party. It's to entertain the fuck out of the player. It's not to literally represent another human player. Amazing lesson. So grateful for that one. One more that is so obvious. But again, if you didn't come up learning game design or thinking game design, it's probably no more obvious to someone who's just sitting down to learn to write fiction and going, oh, wait, most commercial stories have a very simple structure. You know, most commercial stories aren't loaded with tons and tons of subplots. It's very focused. Here's usually where the story turns, give or take 10 pages. This is usually where the story twists into the second act and things like that. And the minute you know it, it becomes obvious. But until then, and you're just an audience member, you don't think about it. So I'm playing GoldenEye. And GoldenEye was, I think, 96. And this was almost as simple as the Uno lesson about, hey, you don't have to fire everything the second you get it. GoldenEye, if I remember correctly, certainly it was the first game that stuck with me, that affected me in this way, where the weapon ammo and managing that ammo was part of your means to success, right? And so you would go into a room and shoot up a bunch of guards and dodge and stealth and what have you. And then you would make sure, you would start to learn, okay, that time between reloading the gun could very well make the difference between surviving this section or dying and having to replay it. And learning when to reload and learning how fast weapons reload and learning when to go into certain rooms and go, you know what, before I open this door, I'm going to totally make sure I'm stocked up as much as I can be on the ammo and it's ready to go. Recognizing that you would never put that on the back of a box, right? Ammo loading system or whatever. All that's happening in the player's head. And it was this awareness of, holy shit, so much of a great game is not what's on the screen. It's what's engaging your brain, and designers consciously come up with that. And I was like, oh my God, that's amazing that they've just gotten a bunch of gameplay out of me and I'm super compelled and super into this game. And it's got nothing to do with the crazy action on the screen. It literally has to do with a math problem of, I've only got 5 bullets left in my AK-47. Maybe I should look around for a full clip and load before I open this door. And none of that's on the screen. That's all in my fucking head. And I just was so jazzed to sort of peel behind the curtain of games and go, that's a key way they work. That's a key way a good game works. Now, good games are important. They're crucial. Why do they work? But just as equally important are playing terrible games, right? There was a game that came out in 2002 or 3. We were in the process of working on God of War. And this was a game, I think it was called like Godai from 3DO. And if you don't know 3DO, they did a bunch of Army Men games. It was clear they had these ambitions to be a great publisher, but for whatever reason, they never put the money, the time, the effort, who the fuck knows, the talent, and they just never executed. And it was just a bunch of C-level, mostly crap. And one of their worst games was this game called Godai. But we were working on God of War. We were in early design phases, and I was trying to play everything that was similar, right? Even though the game's thematics is very different. It was a third-person brawler, puzzle, walk-around, open 3D, not open, but kind of, semi-open 3D environments like God of War. I think there was a fixed camera, and it was horribly reviewed. Like, I think GameSpot gave it a 3 out of 10. I was just like, okay, I have to play this. And I remember renting it from Blockbuster and taking it home and playing it for the weekend because I was like, why is this so bad? And for the love of God, we have to do something to make sure that our game is not this bad. I mean, there's a lot of differences between God of War and Godai, but fundamentally, on paper, you would be forgiven for looking at it and going third person, action adventure, melee combat. It's like, okay, it's the same thing. And it was a lesson, as much as I think ideas and cool mechanics and all that is crucial. It was a wonderful lesson in that those things can't do all the heavy lifting. You have to execute well. The collision in Godai was terrible. The camera was terrible. The enemy combat, maybe the designer had wonderful ideas for it. Like, oh, and maybe it's in the game. But the animation is so hard to read and tell what's going on. And the collision is so broken. And it's so samey and repetitive that it was a great eye-opener of looking at it and going, you can have all the great ideas in the world, Jaffe. And I had a lot of ideas I was proud of, as did the team that they were proud of. But if you can't take that great idea and then make sure that the team can improve it and execute it and bring it to the next level, it doesn't matter because they're not playing your paper design. And again, I know that sounds obvious, but here's the real walk away from it. It's much better to design the game your team can make well. And if you are obsessed with making a specific game and your team can't make that game, that's fine. Then maybe you should leave and go find a team that can, or build that team or figure something out. But the idea of putting the wrong game with the wrong team, it'll kill you every single fucking time, no matter how good the design is. In some ways, even how good the team is. But a good team can take a bad design and make a great game. The lesson of Godai was ideas are important. Commercial ideas are valuable. I'm not one of these guys like, everybody's got ideas. Yeah, but not everybody has good commercial ideas. But execution is staggeringly important in this industry. The last lesson, before the bonus lesson, this was a God of War lesson as well. I was sick one week. I had the flu or something, and I stayed home and I was playing through Indiana Jones, The Emperor's Tomb. Huge Indiana Jones fan, and it was also third-person action adventure. Study those games for God of War. How do they work? Why do they stay engaging? And I loved Emperor's Tomb. Finished the whole fucking thing. But the real aha moment for me was I got to this room. I think it was a Kraken boss or octopus or something. It was just this large kind of atrium that was filled with water. And there wasn't a lot of places to go, but I remember recognizing that they had gotten about an hour, probably a little more of gameplay out of me in that one space. And, this is the time Shannon at God of War and myself were trying to figure out how big the game could be and how ambitious we could be. You can't just make every single room a brand new idea. You've got to be able to get your playtime and make it as compelling as new ideas, but it's got to come from something else. And again, what's happening in the head of the player. And playing this level in Indy was really an eye-opener because I was like, nothing in here is incredibly hard to do at a technical or an execution level. It's just the way they've created this puzzle keeps you engaged, but they're reusing over and over and over the same space for the most part. And I was like, that is a great use of video game space. That is a great way to not pad. See, padding, you feel it, but a great way to create engaging gameplay without breaking the bank. And you can save that money for a bigger special case later. And we ended up using that a bunch in God of War 1. We used that the first time I remember designing with that philosophy in mind was the Pandora's Temple, and you keep coming back to that center room with the giant statue that rises up. I think we probably got over an hour of gameplay out of that one room, and all of that was built around that lesson taken from the Indiana Jones game. So again, you never stop learning. Even though I'm not designing games for the most part actively right now, your brain is always now attuned. And I was playing this game. I had heard a lot of good things about Stadia getting better. And even though I've always loved the streaming tech of Stadia, I was never really into their business model. They didn't have a lot of great games I cared about. But they've just kind of done this thing where there's a lot more games over there now that have trials, kind of like what PlayStation just launched with, I think it's the Essential tier. And I was like, okay, this is kind of cool. I don't have to buy any of these unless I like them, and let me just fuck around. So I was going through playing a bunch of the games, and I came upon this game, which I'd never heard of. Chronos Before the Ashes. Cover art was kind of cool. I said, fuck it, whatever. And I went in totally blind, which I love that about subscription service games. It's not like you've done a bunch of research because you're about to drop $60 and you know so much going in. I knew nothing. Here's what was really cool. So I'm walking around the space in Chronos, and it looks to me like it's like some D&D fantasy setting. I'm like, okay, that's whatever. I don't care. And I guess this is kind of like a little bit like a Souls Light sort of thing. But then suddenly I start encountering these pipes with wires, like electrical piping. And then that piping leads to these machines. And I'm like, what the fuck is this? Right? What is this? And then I find these, this bunker where clearly some experiment has gone on, and there's these crystals, and I activate the crystals and I touch one, and the one I happened to touch sent me to a totally different world, right? Well, here's what I learned about this, which, it has to do with writing and storytelling in video games. And I don't mean, a lot of people talk about, oh, writing is so much better in games now. And a lot of times they're talking about the cutscenes. Not always, but a lot of times. Great, it's effective, but it's mostly a cutscene. Or they talk about environmental storytelling like, a lot of times it's horror games, something's on the wall, like leave us alone, or someone died here, or I'm going crazy, whatever. But this was writing in the context of playing the game, in the sense that I didn't know what the story was, and the environment was genuinely telling an interesting story. And I know that that's kind of a nuanced take on, well, how is that different than writing something on the wall? It may be the same technique. And even though I didn't think this was a particularly great game, I thought that was really good. Because, how many games have we played? It's so tropey of a horror game and shit's written in blood, or you find an audio log. Oh, something went really wrong. Why didn't they believe me? Why didn't they believe me? It's just very tropey, been there, done that. But this was like, and I'm not saying there's something brilliant about putting D&D and technology together, but in the context of this game, it literally was taking the lessons of good writing, or at least good commercial writing, which is to say, make the player wonder what's going on, make the reader wonder what's going to happen next. I want to finish this chapter with a bit of a cliffhanger, so I'm dying to read the next chapter. I don't see that a lot in video games, if at all, with environmental storytelling. But to actually have the aspect of moving through the space and playing the game, and my mind's not only figuring out how to play the game, but my mind is going, what is this world? What is happening here? It just made me realize that there's a lot more work that we could do as creators and designers and writers in video games that is not in this cutscene. And it's not just in environmental storytelling, like, hey, something happened here 5 years ago, 5 minutes ago. It's literally how the space itself engages you at the narrative level as you move through it and interact with it. And it's a little more subtle than some of the more obvious, like, here's how Uno works, right? But you never stop learning. I was fascinated by this. I love to see this. And so even though I may never design fully another video game for the rest of my days, I don't think I'll ever stop being fascinated, because once you peek behind the curtain and understand how this stuff works and why it works, you can't unsee it. And you kind of sometimes don't want to unsee it, because it's really fascinating, because it really is about building a relationship with the brain of the player. It's a lot of times it's like, oh, it's action and the frame rate. And all that's great. All that's crucial. All that's important. A lot of that's marketing. But what's really important is it's about the team sitting down, making decisions that engage your brain and make you feel like you're actually part of this experience that you're having on the screen. And that is craft and art and hard. And it's really fucking impressive when it works. And it's really cool when you recognize how the sausage is made.